You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Hypothesis-driven delivery is the cornerstone of agile experimentation, positioning thin, potentially releasable increments as the fastest and safest way to test real customer need. Instead of committing extensive resources to fully built solutions, teams articulate assumptions and validate them with minimal, focused slices of functionality. This approach acknowledges that much of what organizations believe customers want is untested and uncertain. By treating features as hypotheses to be validated, teams reduce risk and accelerate learning. For example, rather than building a complete reporting suite, a team might release a single high-priority report to measure adoption. The increment itself is not the end goal. It is a vehicle for evidence. On the exam, scenarios about discovery versus delivery often test whether candidates understand this principle. The agile response usually favors building thin increments to test value hypotheses early rather than betting heavily on unproven assumptions. Problem framing with explicit hypotheses provides clarity about who the target users are, what pain points are being addressed, and what outcomes are expected. A well-framed hypothesis might read, "We believe that giving managers a dashboard of team performance metrics will reduce time spent on manual reporting by 30%. Such articulation defines purpose, success criteria, and an evaluation window up front. Without explicit framing, experiments risk drifting into ambiguous exploration where results cannot be clearly interpreted. On the exam, candidates may encounter questions about how to structure early increments or prioritize discovery. The correct agile approach usually emphasizes surfacing hypotheses explicitly, ensuring that everyone understands what is being tested and what success looks like. Clear hypotheses make learning measurable, auditable, and actionable. The concept of a minimum viable increment emphasizes building the smallest integrated slice that can yield meaningful evidence in production-like conditions. Unlike prototypes or mock-ups, an increment is potentially releasable, capable of generating authentic user behavior data. For instance, a team validating mobile checkout flow might release only one payment method initially, measuring adoption and completion rates. The goal is not to deliver a full-featured solution, but to learn quickly with minimal scope. On the exam, candidates may face scenarios about how much functionality to include in an experiment. The agile response typically highlights building the smallest increment that provides insight while avoiding unnecessary investment. Minimum viable increments transform discovery into a low-cost, evidence-driven process that informs whether further scaling is worthwhile. Slice selection is guided by criteria such as risk, learning value, dependency complexity, and measurability. The best slices are those that maximize insight while minimizing scope and cycle time. For example, a team might choose to release a small but high-risk feature like real-time notifications because it tests critical infrastructure assumptions. Alternatively, they may select a slice with high learning value, such as testing whether customers even use a proposed workflow. Choosing poorly sized slices creates wasted effort and delayed feedback. On the exam, scenarios about backlog prioritization often involve deciding what to test first. The correct agile response usually favors slices that validate the riskiest or most uncertain assumptions quickly. This ensures that investment decisions are based on real data rather than speculation. Acceptance criteria for experimental increments must incorporate learning goals. Beyond verifying functional correctness, criteria should define observable behaviors, telemetry checkpoints, and thresholds that confirm or disconfirm hypotheses. For example, acceptance criteria for a new onboarding flow might include at least 60% of users who start the flow complete it within 5 minutes. This shifts acceptance from purely technical delivery to validated value. Without embedding learning into acceptance, experiments risk generating inconclusive results. On the exam, candidates may be tested on how to ensure increments produce meaningful evidence. The agile answer typically emphasizes integrating learning objectives into acceptance criteria, ensuring that increments are judged not only on whether they work but on whether they create insight. Instrumentation and telemetry planning establish how data will be captured during experiments. Teams must define what events, attributes, and interactions to track, ensuring data is reliable and privacy-conscious. For instance, logging time to complete or drop-off point in a workflow provides signals about user experience. Equally important is respecting privacy, anonymizing data, and following compliance requirements. Without good telemetry, experiments risk producing ambiguous or misleading results. On the exam, candidates may encounter scenarios about measuring outcomes. The correct agile response usually involves planning instrumentation deliberately, balancing the need for insight with responsible handling of sensitive information. Instrumentation turns increments into experiments by ensuring that behavior is observable and evidence can be trusted. Experiment design often includes staged rollouts, beta cohorts, or control groups. These patterns allow teams to test in real conditions while limiting exposure and isolating effects. For example, a team might release a feature to 10% of users initially, expanding gradually if results are positive. Alternatively, they may compare outcomes between an experimental cohort and a control group to ensure observed changes are real. Runtime configuration, such as feature toggles, makes this possible without redeploying code. On the exam, questions about risk management in experimentation often highlight rollout strategies. The agile answer usually favors staged exposure and control groups, emphasizing learning while minimizing downside. Experiments are not reckless gambles but carefully structured probes designed to reveal truth safely. The definition of done for experiments extends beyond functionality to include readiness for learning. It should ensure monitoring is set up, rollback mechanisms are in place, and analysis plans are documented. For example, an experiment may not be done unless dashboards are configured to capture key metrics and a rollback plan is rehearsed. Without these safeguards, teams risk producing increments that cannot be trusted or safely reversed. On the exam, scenarios about experiment completion often test whether candidates understand this broader scope. The correct agile response usually emphasizes that done includes readiness to learn and to recover, not just working code. Experiments succeed only when they are both operationally safe and analytically useful. Data management for early increments requires careful attention to test data seeding, anonymization, and retention. Teams must ensure that experimental data is realistic enough to yield meaningful results while still protecting user privacy. For example, anonymizing user identifiers while retaining behavioral patterns allows analysis without exposing personal information. Retention boundaries prevent old data from skewing results or creating compliance risks. On the exam, scenarios about early experiments may test whether candidates can balance governance with learning. The agile answer usually emphasizes privacy-conscious, policy-aligned data practices that still preserve signal quality. Responsible data management ensures that experimentation remains ethical, compliant, and effective. Stakeholder alignment is critical in hypothesis-driven delivery. Before experiments begin, stakeholders should agree on the hypothesis being tested, the predicted impact, and the stop-loss rules. Stop-loss rules, such as terminating the experiment if adoption remains below a threshold after 2 weeks, prevent opportunistic scope expansion. Without alignment, experiments risk becoming endless explorations or political debates. On the exam, stakeholder alignment often underpins scenarios where teams must manage expectations. The agile response usually emphasizes formalizing hypotheses and rules in advance, creating accountability and clarity. Aligning stakeholders ensures that experiments remain disciplined, purposeful, and trusted across the organization. Risk containment strategies make experimentation safe. Teams apply blast radius limits to control exposure, use progressive delivery to expand gradually, and rely on automated kill switches for immediate rollback. For instance, a payment feature might first be enabled for a handful of internal users before scaling to the broader customer base. These safeguards ensure that failures remain small, protecting reputation and customer trust. On the exam, risk containment often appears in scenarios about how to limit downside during discovery. The correct agile response usually involves using staged exposure and automated rollback rather than broad risky releases. Agile experimentation values learning, but never at the expense of safety or trust. Measurement strategies must prioritize leading indicators and proxy outcomes. Waiting months for lagging benefits like revenue growth is impractical for experimentation. Instead, teams look for early signs, such as engagement rates, completion times, or repeat usage. These proxies provide actionable signals while acknowledging that ultimate business benefits will take longer to materialize. For example, if early adopters engage deeply with a new workflow, it is a leading indicator that broader adoption may succeed. On the exam, measurement scenarios often test whether candidates can distinguish between fast-moving proxies and slow-moving outcomes. The agile answer usually favors leading indicators for experiment decisions, while still tracking lagging benefits for confirmation. Feedback capture should blend passive telemetry with active channels. Passive telemetry reveals what users do, while structured feedback, such as surveys, support tickets, or interviews, explains why. Combining both creates a richer picture of customer response. For example, telemetry may show that users abandon a process halfway through, while interviews reveal that the instructions were confusing. On the exam, scenarios about gathering feedback often test whether candidates understand the value of triangulating data. The agile response usually emphasizes using both quantitative and qualitative inputs to reduce blind spots. Agile experimentation is not just about counting clicks, it is about understanding human behavior behind the metrics. A learning backlog ensures that insights from experiments are not lost but converted into follow-on questions and refined assumptions. For example, if an experiment disproves one hypothesis, the team might add a backlog item to test a different approach. This backlog sustains momentum by maintaining a pipeline of discovery, not just delivery. It keeps learning visible and prioritized alongside feature work. On the exam, candidates may face questions about how to continue after an experiment concludes. The agile answer usually emphasizes feeding results into a learning backlog, ensuring that knowledge is systematically pursued rather than ad hoc. This practice reflects agility's belief that learning is continuous and cumulative. Lightweight governance provides the ethical and procedural boundaries for experimentation. This includes defining security checks, compliance approvals, and ethical limits. For example, a team experimenting with user behavior may require data anonymization and explicit review before rollout. Governance ensures that experiments remain responsible and safe without becoming bogged down in bureaucracy. On the exam, scenarios about governance often test whether candidates can balance oversight with agility. The correct agile response usually emphasizes lightweight, principle-based governance that preserves speed while upholding ethics. Agile experimentation thrives when responsibility and discipline are baked into the process, enabling trust without excessive overhead. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Build versus buy analysis is often the first consideration when designing an experiment. The choice is not only about long-term ownership, but about speed to validated learning. Sometimes building a lightweight slice internally provides better control and flexibility, but in other cases, integrating an existing tool or service allows teams to gather data faster with less upfront effort. For example, using a third-party survey tool may validate customer interest before investing in a custom feedback system. On the exam, build versus buy scenarios often test whether candidates can weigh time to signal, integration effort, and long-term cost. The agile response usually favors the option that delivers safe, fast learning while keeping future pathways open. Experiments are about generating evidence, not building infrastructure prematurely. Architecture for experimentation favors modular boundaries, contract-first interfaces, and decoupled deployments. This ensures increments can be shipped independently and, just as importantly, retired cleanly if they prove unhelpful. For instance, a team might create a microservice to test a recommendation engine, keeping it isolated from the main platform until validated. If the experiment succeeds, the service can be expanded. If not, it can be removed without disrupting core systems. On the exam, scenarios about architecture and experimentation often test whether candidates understand the need for adaptability. The correct response usually emphasizes modularity and decoupling, reinforcing that architecture is not about permanence but about enabling fast, reversible learning. Data quality safeguards are essential to prevent spurious conclusions. Poorly selected cohorts, seasonal effects, or unrepresentative samples can distort results. For example, launching a pricing experiment only during holiday sales may exaggerate demand, leading to misguided investment. Teams must design experiments to capture reliable, representative signals. This might involve randomization, ensuring sample size is sufficient, or running tests across multiple time periods. On the exam, candidates may encounter scenarios where results seem positive but are biased. The agile answer usually emphasizes validating data quality before drawing conclusions. Learning is only as good as the evidence it rests on, and poor data can be more damaging than no data at all. Operational readiness must be addressed even in experiments. While over-engineering is unnecessary, teams still need monitoring baselines and lightweight service objectives appropriate for a trial. For example, an experimental checkout feature may not need enterprise-grade scalability, but it should have basic error monitoring to catch failures quickly. Observability ensures issues surface early, preventing surprises from reaching customers unchecked. On the exam, readiness often appears in scenarios about balancing effort with risk. The agile response usually involves preparing just enough operational support to protect learning and customer trust without delaying discovery. This reflects agility's balance between prudence and speed. Experiments must be safe, even if lightweight. Rollout strategies such as canary releases, ring deployments, or opt-in programs allow controlled exposure of increments. A canary rollout might start with 1% of traffic, expanding gradually if performance holds. Ring deployment involves sequencing by groups, such as internal users first, then a regional subset, then global customers. Opt-in programs allow willing users to self-select into trials, reducing risk of backlash. These approaches align exposure with risk and learning goals, ensuring that failures remain small while still generating meaningful data. On the exam, rollout strategies often appear in risk management contexts. The agile answer usually emphasizes staged exposure rather than all-at-once releases, highlighting prudence in experimentation. The feature toggle lifecycle is a critical but often overlooked aspect of experimentation. Toggles allow features to be activated or deactivated dynamically, supporting safe rollout. However, leaving toggles in place indefinitely accumulates hidden complexity. Agile teams must define ownership, documentation, and timely removal of toggles once experiments conclude. For instance, a toggle used for a beta rollout should be retired once the feature is either validated and scaled or abandoned. On the exam, scenarios about feature flags often test whether candidates recognize both their advantages and their risks. The correct agile response usually involves disciplined lifecycle management, preventing experiments from leaving technical residue that undermines future flow. Customer communication policies clarify how and when to disclose experiments. Transparency builds trust, but disclosure must be balanced to preserve experimental integrity and avoid expectancy effects. For example, customers told they are part of a trial may change their behavior, skewing results. At the same time, failing to disclose in sensitive areas such as pricing may damage trust if discovered. Agile teams must set policies that respect ethics and customer relationships while still enabling valid experiments. On the exam, candidates may face scenarios about balancing trust with learning. The correct Agile response usually emphasizes ethical transparency, especially when customer impact is significant. Experiments succeed only when both evidence and trust are preserved. Cross-functional coordination is essential for experiment readiness. Product managers, designers, engineers, data analysts, legal advisors, and support staff must align from day one. For example, legal teams may confirm compliance requirements, while support staff prepare to handle user questions. This integration ensures that increments are not only functional but safe, analyzable, and aligned with organizational responsibilities. On the exam, cross-functional readiness often appears in scenarios where teams overlook key perspectives. The Agile answer usually emphasizes involving multiple disciplines early, recognizing that safe and effective experimentation requires contributions beyond development. Agile delivery thrives when diverse skills are integrated into cohesive effort. Decision frameworks define how results will be evaluated and when to pivot, persevere, or expand. These frameworks specify success thresholds, confidence criteria, and review cadences. For instance, a team might decide that if engagement increases by more than 20% within 2 weeks, the feature will be scaled. If not, it will be retired. Having these rules pre-established prevents bias and opportunistic interpretation. On the exam, scenarios about inconclusive results often test whether candidates understand the need for clear decision rules. The Agile response usually emphasizes predefined thresholds that protect objectivity. Without decision frameworks, experiments risk being manipulated to justify predetermined conclusions rather than providing genuine learning. Post-experiment synthesis integrates quantitative results with qualitative insights. Metrics provide evidence of behavior, while user interviews or support notes explain why those behaviors occurred. For example, data may show high drop-off at a registration step, while feedback reveals confusion about instructions. Synthesis creates a complete picture, reducing causal uncertainty and shaping follow-up actions. On the exam, candidates may face scenarios where teams must decide how to interpret mixed results. The Agile answer usually emphasizes integrating both data and narrative, acknowledging complexity rather than oversimplifying. Post-experiment synthesis turns raw results into actionable knowledge, ensuring that learning guides future investment. A portfolio view of experiments balances discovery across themes and maturities. Some experiments may target quick wins, while others explore foundational bets with longer horizons. Managing experiments as a portfolio prevents over-concentration on low-risk, incremental improvements or on high-risk moonshots. For example, a team may allocate capacity to both a minor UI test and a strategic product expansion. This balance sustains a flow of validated learning that fuels both immediate progress and long-term innovation. On the exam, portfolio scenarios often test whether candidates understand the need to diversify experiments. The Agile answer usually emphasizes balancing short-term and long-term discovery, much like managing a product portfolio across investments. Scaling a validated increment requires shifting focus from learning to hardening. The experiment provided evidence that the feature creates value, but the increment may lack performance, security, or operability robustness. For example, a prototype checkout system that proved adoption must now undergo rigorous testing, monitoring setup, and integration. Scaling ensures that the value validated in discovery can be sustained at production scale. On the exam, scaling scenarios often test whether candidates can distinguish between experimental and production readiness. The Agile response usually emphasizes hardening validated increments before full rollout. This transition preserves validated behaviors while building the reliability needed for widespread adoption. Benefit realization tracking closes the loop between validated signals and long-term outcomes. While early experiments rely on proxies like engagement, scaling requires confirming durable benefits such as retention, cost savings, or reduced risk. For example, a feature that boosted short-term usage must be assessed months later for its impact on revenue or churn. This tracking ensures that early enthusiasm translates into real business value. On the exam, benefit realization often appears in scenarios about sustaining accountability. The correct agile response usually emphasizes linking validated learning to downstream outcomes. Agile experimentation is not complete until hypotheses are connected to enduring impact. Institutionalizing learning ensures that experimentation becomes repeatable and consistent across teams. This involves creating templates for hypothesis writing, repositories for results, and training that reinforces ethical and analytical rigor. For instance, a central knowledge base may store past experiments, preventing duplication and accelerating future design. Institutionalization turns experimentation into a cultural capability rather than a sporadic activity. On the exam, candidates may face questions about sustaining learning beyond a single project. The agile answer usually emphasizes creating systems that standardize and spread learning. This practice reflects agility's focus on continuous improvement and shared growth, ensuring that validated insights scale across the organization. In conclusion, experiment-first delivery transforms uncertainty into informed investment. By building thin slices, framing explicit hypotheses, and embedding measurement into increments, teams learn quickly and safely. Architecture, data quality, and rollout practices ensure experiments generate valid evidence without undue risk. Decision frameworks, synthesis practices, and portfolio perspectives sustain momentum and objectivity. Scaling validated increments hardens them for real-world use, while benefit realization confirms that early signals produce durable impact. Institutionalizing these practices embeds experimentation into organizational culture, creating a cycle of discovery that strengthens adaptability. On the exam, candidates who understand these principles will recognize why thin, disciplined experiments are at the heart of agility, enabling decisions based on evidence rather than assumption. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.